Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the Africa Dialogue Series, which is an interactive platform for decision makers, civil society, experts in the academia to discuss the challenges and opportunities for Africa's development. My name is Elizabeth Nyamayaro. I'm Special Advisor at the United Nations World Food Programme, and it is my honor to be your host and moderator today. We have an exciting program ahead of us, but before we begin, a very important logistical note. There's an interpretation tool available which can provide a translation of today's content in French, Portuguese, Arabic, as well as English. You'll find the interpretation button with the globe at the bottom of your screen, and you can change it at any time. There's also a dedicated function for you to type your questions, which will be addressed during the Q&A portion of today's program. Now, I want to thank you for joining us. Today, we come together to discuss the importance of social protection in enhancing food security and nutrition for greater resilience on the African continent. The African Union's theme for 2022 highlights the key role that resilience in nutrition achieved through multi-sectoral actions across food, health, education, and social protection systems can play in fostering human, social, and economic capital development in Africa. And there's never been a more critical time for action that supports this mission. Food and nutrition security are in themselves important elements of individual resilience, but they can also enhance the resilience of whole economies by improving the health and productivity of individuals. On this, I speak from personal experience. I was raised by my gogo, my grandmother, in a small village in Zimbabwe. And by the time I was 8 years old, I'd experienced 2 near-death experiences due to malnutrition. At the age of 1, I had acute kwashiorkor, and when my gogo rushed me to the nearest clinic, the nurse told it that it was too late and gave me 3 days to live. But gogo searched for food in my village. She nursed me back to health, and I survived. At the age of 8, a severe drought hit my village, leaving us with nothing to eat and drink. We went for days without food. One day, I was so weak from hunger that I was unable to move. I collapsed onto the ground, and in my young mind, I thought I was going to die. But then a miracle happened. An aid worker with the United Nations found me. She gave me a bowl of porridge that saved my life. This was the moment that sparked my commitment to become a humanitarian. So I know too well the importance of the work that has brought us here today. For today's event, we have a distinguished set of speakers who will shed light on these topics. So without further ado, it is now my honor to invite to our virtual stage, Ms. Christina Duarte, United Nations Under-Secretary General and Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on Africa, for some welcoming remarks. USG Duarte, you have the floor.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And a good afternoon from Kigali, Rwanda. Allow me to jump into my welcome remarks. And thank you for your touching story, Elizabeth. Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. It is an honor to welcome you to this third international webinar of the 2022 Africa Dialogue Series. Allow me to start by thanking the International Labour Organization and the World Food Programme for having accepted OSA's invitation to organize this webinar and this whole week of activities around the role of social protection in enhancing food security and nutrition for greater resilience in Africa. I would also like to thank to United Nations Deputy Secretary General for continued support to the ADS discussions. Unfortunately, the DSG will not be able to participate today live, but she has submitted a video message to set the stage of today's panel discussion. I would like to convey a special thank you to our panelists for their availability to be here today, in particular to Her Excellency, Ms. Nevin El Kabaj, Minister of Social Solidarity of Egypt, and His Excellency, Mr. Ali Beti, High Commissioner of the Government of Niger. Dear colleagues, social protection is one of the most essential tools for African policymakers to build resilient societies that can overcome current and future crises. 2 years ago, the COVID-19 outbreak developed from a health emergency into a multidimensional crisis that led to unemployment, increased poverty, and huge impact on education, among other consequences. The war in Ukraine is now contributing to worsening living conditions in Africa and across the world, deteriorating food security, triggering spikes in price, and all in all, threatening to unleash another socioeconomic crisis. The main lesson that we can learn from these adverse events is that external shocks are a reality, that we cannot prevent them, that our current structures are not prepared to mitigate them either. Recovering from the COVID-19, tackling the impact of the war in Ukraine on Africa, both requires people-centered policies with a strong income distribution dimension that prevent this crisis from increasing inequalities in the continent and prepare African countries to face future challenges. In this context, social protection policies are the solution. Between 2000 and 2015, non-contributory social protection schemes in Africa tripled, playing a substantial role in the reduction of poverty and vulnerabilities in the continent. Furthermore, during the last 2 years, African countries launched over 230 social protection measures to mitigate the social consequences of the crisis. This shows that we are in the right track. In order to move to the next level and maximize the impact of social protection systems, it is crucial to understand the contribution that social protection policies can play as a macroeconomic tool, and that we ensure their sustainability. For this, mobilizing resources, particularly domestic resources, is critical. But it's not the only step that we must take. We need to recognize and embrace the role that informal and community-based safety nets play in African countries. In fact, in sub-Saharan Africa, only 10% of the economically active population is covered by statutory social protection programs. Of the remaining 90% of the population, some have other types of social coverage that is not reflected by official statistics, and some have no coverage at all. Therefore, our challenge is to get a clear picture of the social protection coverage in Africa and ensure that we extend it until reach 100% of the population. In order to achieve this goal, we should not try to formalize all social protection systems. We know, based on the experience of other countries, that social protection systems that take a top-down approach exclusively are not sustainable. We need to leverage the different outreach and characteristics of formal and informal social protection schemes in order to generate results in the short term, increase the resilience of social protection networks against external shocks, and promote a multiplier effect where every dollar invested is maximized. It is high time for us to design and implement homegrown, forward-looking human capital policies that approach informal schemes as an asset to reduce vulnerabilities and inequalities, to promote resilience and inclusion of people with disabilities, women, the youth, migrants, and refugees, and all and other vulnerable populations. I would like to assure you that the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa is ready to take up this challenge and trust that this year's ADS, Africa Dialogue Series, will help us advance together toward this goal. Thank you, Elizabeth. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Yeshua Duarte, for these inspiring words. And now please join me in welcoming the opening remarks from our co-organizers of this session, Mr. David Beasley, United Nations World Food Programme Executive Director, and Mr. Guy Rader, Director General at the International Labour Organization, who both have a special video messages for us.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to take part in the Africa Dialogue Series this week. Thank you so much. The world is truly at a critical crossroads. We're facing unprecedented global hunger crisis as conflict, climate shocks, COVID-19, soaring costs, and now on top of all of that, Ukraine, driving millions of people closer to starvation. As a result of this conflict, WFP believes that another 47 million people will face acute hunger this year. And that's on top of the 276 million at the start of 2022, with the steepest rises likely in sub-Saharan Africa. The war is piling catastrophe on top of catastrophe across Africa and around the world. In Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, for example, an estimated 4 million children under 5 are likely to suffer from acute malnutrition this year. That's an increase of nearly 30% from 2021. So it's more important than ever that we work together to deal with the global ripple effects of this crisis. Social protection programs are a powerful tool that can help the most vulnerable communities avoid the worst effects of economic deterioration, natural disasters, and conflict. They increase the purchasing power of poor families and help them across to the nutritious foods that are absolutely vital for the well-being and development of children. They also support efforts to combat inequalities and create a pathway to more stable and prosperous societies. I'm proud to say that WFP has a long history of supporting African governments working to scale up and enhance social protection programs, from enabling cash transfers to ensuring that school feeding schemes provide the very best nutrition to support healthy growth. So, even as we come together to deal with the current crisis, it's critical we continue working to ensure that everyone, no matter where they live, has better access to social protection programs to bolster their resilience against future insecurity of food. The African Union's focus on nutrition in 2022 is a great opportunity to drive progress on this vital agenda, agreeing concrete action to build a more prosperous and sustainable future for the entire continent. At WFP, we stand ready to work with the African Union and all its member states as we step up our efforts to tackle the scourge of malnutrition and create a brighter future for all of Africa's children. I am confident that together we can succeed. Thank you.
Excellencies, ministers, workers and employers' representatives, ladies and gentlemen, my warmest greetings to you all. I must thank Her Excellency Cristina Duarte, the UN Special Advisor on Africa, for inviting the ILO to partner with the World Food Programme to convene this timely discussion. Important at any time, when crises strike, the value of social protection really stands out. It provides a crucial buffer protecting families, enabling women and men to be resilient and to be proactive in rebuilding lives, communities and their societies. And the experience of COVID-19 has demonstrated all of this amply. And coming on top of numerous shocks in recent decades, the COVID-19 pandemic has further aggravated development challenges in Africa and elsewhere. And now soaring food and fuel prices are expected to further worsen the food security and overall human security situation. The pandemic reversed hard-won gains in poverty reduction in Africa, pushing 47 million into extreme poverty. The new poor increased by 55 million, and 46 million more were at risk of hunger and malnutrition. And it is sobering to recall that after years of decline globally, the incidence of child labour is rising, and this started before the pandemic. And the pandemic has exposed glaring gaps in social protection, particularly in the informal economy. Globally, only 46% of the global population are effectively covered by at least one social benefit. And however, in Africa, the figure is still lower, with only 17% of the population having such minimum protection. Not surprisingly, this huge coverage gap mirrors significant underinvestment in social protection. In 2020, average social protection expenditure stood at less than 5% of GDP on the African continent, compared with the global average of 8.6%. Yet, ladies and gentlemen, the statistics do not reflect lack of recognition of the importance of social protection on the continent. Many African countries have enshrined the right to social security for all in their constitutions, and others have developed comprehensive policies to promote social protection and to ensure universal access. The African Union has adopted frameworks, policies and strategies that integrate the role of social protection in eradicating poverty, reducing inequality, and promoting inclusive and sustainable development. And the ILO African constituents at the African Regional Conference in 2019 adopted conclusions which called for progressively extending sustainable social protection coverage. And at the International Labour Conference in 2021, ILO constituents worldwide made a firm commitment to build universal social protection systems. It is more than time to act decisively and to use all of the tools available to translate these commitments into reality. Ladies and gentlemen, the ILO's African Regional Social Protection Strategy 2021 to 2025 points to a clear way forward for the very practical work that really needs to be done. This strategy aims to support countries to accelerate social protection coverage so that 40% of the continent's population is covered by at least one social protection benefit by 2025. National policy decisions, including resource decisions to support social protection in a coherent policy environment, will be essential. And priority groups must be those in the informal economy, agricultural workers, and rural populations. Building strategic partnerships at the national, regional, and international levels can also help to drive action. And the Global Accelerator on Jobs and Social Protection for Just Transition, launched by the United Nations Secretary General last September, can and must give strong impetus to these efforts. Through multilateral cooperation, the Accelerator aims to support countries to create at least 400 million jobs, primarily in the green and care economies, and extending social protection to the 4 billion people worldwide who are currently not yet adequately covered. The ILO is striving to do its part to mobilize the multilateral community around these objectives. Ladies and gentlemen, investing in social protection is an investment in a human-centered development path and in resilient, equitable societies. It is a driver of economic development. It is one of the pillars of decent work and is integral to the foundation of social justice that fosters lasting peace and stability. Count on the ILO's support in shaping the social protection policies that can enhance food security and nutrition for greater resilience in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Beasley and Mr. Ryder, for your bold commitments, but also for this stark reminder of the current challenges that we face. We know that as a collective, there's nothing that we can't overcome. And as is rightly pointed out, social protection is an investment in resilience as well as a driver for economic development. It is now my distinct privilege to introduce Her Excellency Amina J. Mohammed, United Nations Deputy Secretary General, to officially open our session. And I believe that we have some incredible recorded remarks from her. Apologies to interrupt the playback. I don't believe that we have sound for the participants.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a pleasure to join you today for the Africa Dialogue Series, ADS, international webinar on the role of social protection in enhancing food security and nutrition for greater resilience in Africa. Throughout this month, the Africa Dialogue Series is focusing on the resilience of food systems in Africa with the objective of addressing a harsh reality, external shocks such as COVID-19 pandemic, and the global impacts of the war in Ukraine continue to have a disproportionate impact on African countries. In 2022, over 100 million people across hotspot countries in the continent are projected to be in acute food insecurity, representing a stark 22% increase from only just a year ago. This week, the ADS turns towards social protection as a means to strengthen resilience, bearing in mind that currently Africa has the lowest social protection coverage in the world, 17% of the total population, compared with the global average of 47%. Social protection programs are the most effective tool to address both the drivers and the consequences of food insecurity and malnutrition. But we must maximize the potential of social protection programs. We need to take 4 urgent actions. First, promote universal social protection programs that lead to income distribution outcomes that ensure the sustainability of economic growth. This requires moving away from an assistance charity approach to a clear recognition that social protection policies should be designed to generate social, economic, and cultural returns. For example, by adopting food for asset policies that build or rehabilitate assets that will improve long-term food security and resilience, in addition to cash transfers to address food security. Second, improve access to healthy diets through school meals, especially designed to address malnutrition. Homegrown school meals programs are a perfect example of social protection policies that have a wider impact, promoting economic growth and social cohesion in local communities. Third, strengthen domestic resource mobilization systems to underpin social protection policies. It is indispensable for Africa's resilience that essential policies such as social protection are funded through national budgets to ensure their long-term sustainability. Financing social protection must also be linked to overall financing in social sectors, including decent job creation in the green care and digital economies. This integrated approach could yield the dual benefit of mobilizing additional financing for social protection systems through social security contributions, while simultaneously preparing populations for the global economy of the future and bolstering their resilience against future shocks. Fourth, promote the efficiency and reprioritization of public expenditure in line with these key priorities. Inefficiency of public spending in education, infrastructure, and health represent a combined annual loss of 2.8% of Africa's GDP. Increasing the efficiency of public spending would free enough resources to finance strong social protection systems. I trust that today's discussions will assess some of these measures and propose actionable recommendations to advance towards social protection systems in Africa. I wish you fruitful deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you, DSG, for setting the stage for us. You've reminded us that over 100 million people across hotspot countries on the African continent are projected to be in acute food insecurity. But you've also reminded us that social protection programs are the most effective tool to address both the drivers and the consequences of food insecurity and malnutrition. Most importantly, you have reminded us that the African continent has what it takes to deliver on this promise, emphasizing that it is the indispensable that for Africa's resilience, that essential policies such as social protection are funded through national budgets to ensure their long-term sustainability. I believe that we can achieve this. We are now moving to the panel discussion. I'm particularly excited to welcome our 5 experts to our virtual stage. The first person, Honorable Niveen Al-Gabash, Minister of Social Solidarity in Egypt. His Excellency Ali Beti, High Commissioner of the Nigerian Nourishing Nigerians 3N Initiative in Niger. Dr. Jimmy Adesini, Professor of Sociology and South African Research Chair in Social Policy at the College of Graduate Studies at University of South Africa. Mr. Joe Odiji, Deputy General Secretary, African Regional Organization of the International Trade Union Confederation. Mr. Douglas Opio, Secretary General of the Federation of Uganda Employers. We are so excited to have you today, all panelists. You represent a diversity of cultures and perspective and fields of study, but you all agree that nutrition is critical to unlocking global progress, and you are committed to take action to support it, which is why we want to create a space for rich conversation and dialogue today. And with that in mind, I kindly ask that you keep your remarks concise so that we can allow time for others, as well as questions from our highly engaged audience. I'm going to turn to you, Honorable Al-Gabash, to kick us off. We know that while the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated a triple health, education, and economic crisis, it has also provided an opportunity for a set of transformative social policy interventions in Egypt. Could you please elaborate on how the national social protection system has adjusted to prevent deteriorations of the nutrition situation for the most vulnerable during the pandemic? You have the floor.
Morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and great pleasure to all of the participants and valuable organizers. The government of Egypt has allocated an emergency response package with 6.3 billion, approximately 1.8% of GDP, to enhance preparedness, response, and governance in response to the COVID-19, and around $320 million were allocated to provide necessary supplies food supplies for the most impoverished persons, especially in the rural areas, in the remote areas, and in poorest families that were allocated and targeted through our proxy means testing. I think our interventions regarding social protection were inclusive in order to increase our beneficiaries from the conditional cash transfer. We expanded our cash transfer to above 500,000 households, summing up to around 2 million individuals. Additionally, the government of Egypt has provided 4 million households with food packages in coordination with partner NGOs. And also we had the longest convoy for food packages that were registered on Guinness record according to in 2021. And in 2022 also we had above 7 million packages for 48 tons of dry foodstuff and also 2,000 tons of chicken. There was a system that was followed by the religious institution and Awqaf and Al-Azhar institution in order to provide meat packages throughout the year. We target the poorest families on our poverty map. There's also food that was distributed on the ration cards for the first 1,000 days in the lives of children, pregnant mothers, and lactating that were targeted in the poorest areas, and those who are suffering from health conditions. In addition, that was with the support of the African Food Development Bank and the World Food Program. I think also we had boxes for the social care institutions that include orphans and people with disabilities in order to ensure the nutrition, full nutrition for these children. On our economic empowerment opportunities, we target the SMEs, the small and micro enterprise projects that were specifically oriented or targeting having food industry, husbandry, poultry, and everything that is related to food security. We had more than 13,000 micro enterprise projects that were allocated for households. And additionally, we paid on behalf of more than around 500,000 women that were have credit in order to pay back their installments for SMEs. We paid 50% of their payback. But finally, I think also the casual labor had more important from our part, especially that they lost their seasonal or even their irregular work. So we're very keen on to protect their households. The government has allocated emergency cash support to about 1.6 million irregular workers with a total amount of $45 million. I think the support of the government added to the banks and the CSR that happened through the private sector, added to the support of NGOs and religious institutions were very much of a benefit in order to ensure the minimal food packages and food nutrition in order to protect the most vulnerable, that are children in the first 1,000 days, women lactating and pregnant, families with health conditions, women head of the households, and children at the age under 6 years. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. Hoping you all the best for such a wonderful and fruitful session.
Minister, you've been incredibly busy. What incredible impact you have created, really. And thank you so much for prioritizing women and children as well, because we often know that women often get left behind. I actually am very curious because I know that beyond what you've explained, you've also been leveraging digital technologies for greater social inclusion in Egypt. Can you share a little bit about that?
I think the technology that we have developed, especially that Egypt is heading towards digital transformation at large, but I think this period was very much of a benefit for us in accordance with COVID-19. The government has multiplied its efforts to have the digital technology, especially with the Rapid Pro. That Rapid Pro is a program that has been supported by UNICEF Egypt to enable the ministry to create a digital communication channel with its beneficiaries through which it shares awareness messages under WAI program. WAI is awareness on various cultural and awareness issues that concern food and nutrition, especially for the families in order to rationalize the use of food. We also distributed through this Rapid Pro of food packages to nurseries, especially the children under 6 are very viable, and we are doing an impact assessment to measure the impact of nutrition of nurses through this period, with another experimental control group to see what can we do in nurseries at large. I think also the platform that we developed mainly targeted the most impoverished, which around 4.1 million households, and these are beneficiaries of our conditional cash transfer program. We distributed SIM cards for these households in order to report to us on incidents of any problems and risks that they might suffer from, they and their children. And we had this SIM card and the first year paid by the Ministry of Social Solidarity in order to have them changing their behavior and enhancing their digital behavior. Through the digital transformation, also we had the opportunity to do the electronic payment, especially for the pensioners and for the elderly person that have the risk of being in front of the payments and the ATMs. So we did most of our best in order to have free of charge ATM usage and also electronic transfers through family programs in order to protect them from being to go to the post offices. Also, I think the Ministry of Social Solidarity has intensified its electronic networks with the Ministry of Health and Population, as equal as to the Ministry of Food and Supply and the Ministry of Agriculture, to ensure that all of us are aligned with electronic networks between the 3 ministries. We availed food portion cards for all the beneficiaries that benefit from cash transfer. We had a protocol with the Ministry of Food and Supply in order to avail food packages for these households. I think also the Ministry of Food and Supply has allocated more than one service through electronic and digital transformation. And finally, with the Ministry of Agriculture, we had more than protocols and effectively working on ground in order to build liaison between those who have husbandry and poultry upbringing, in order to give them insights so as not to lose them and to ensure that the minimal amount of milk is being produced and also mechanically and electronically collected and distributed to the most impoverished households and those who have children under 6. So I think the digital transformation that we developed throughout the previous 2 years were a plus to the ministry, and we're still doing the same with our partners. And finally, we, for the first time, we have our social units at the village level fully and electronically equipped and opened a direct channel with them, whether through electronic networks or through direct phones with no cost, in accordance with the Ministry of Telecommunication. So I think Egypt has, especially the Ministry of Social Solidarity, that was not electronically before connected. Now, throughout these 2 years, COVID-19, was a big support to us, although of all of its mal benefits, but there were positive benefits as well for the ministry to develop its digital transformation, and we're still ongoing. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Minister, for these inspiring insights. I'm going to turn over to you, Your Excellency Ali Betty. You oversee the implementation of the 3N initiative, which is the government's first centralized and cross-sectional policy, which emphasizes food security and nutrition as a catalyzer of socio-economic resilience of communities in Niger. Can you please tell us a bit more about that role the social protection can play within the 3N initiative? Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup. Je me réjouis d'être avec vous pour cet événement et merci de m'avoir invité. Donc, je vais vous en dire un mot effectivement sur le rôle de la protection sociale dans l'initiative 3N. Donc, le Niger a élaboré la stratégie de sécurité alimentaire et nutritionnelle et de développement agricole durable comme étant une priorité nationale dans un contexte qui est particulièrement marqué par les changements climatiques, les sécheresses, les inondations, les insécurités qui se traduisent par des mouvements de population, entre autres. Donc, la mise en œuvre de cette stratégie, nous la mettons en place donc, depuis 2011. Et cette stratégie intègre à la fois des investissements structurants dans les systèmes alimentaires, notamment dans le domaine de la maîtrise de l'eau, qui est une des premières actions d'adaptation dans ce contexte de changement climatique, mais aussi l'accroissement des productions, la promotion des chaînes de valeur et la restauration de l'environnement. Elle intègre également des mesures permettant de renforcer la résilience des ménages vulnérables notamment, à travers des interventions qui les ciblent directement et qui sont fondées sur les principes de la protection sociale. Donc, l'initiative 3N est mise en œuvre à travers des plans d'action quinquennaux. Et donc, le plan d'action quinquennal, en particulier 2016-2020, que nous avons évalué il y a un an avant de reprogrammer un nouveau plan d'action, a marqué un tournant en réaffirmant la nécessité de mobiliser les instruments de la protection sociale pour adresser la vulnérabilité chronique des ménages ruraux, notamment les plus vulnérables, en complément des réponses ponctuelles de différents chocs, notamment en période de soudure. Ceci a permis de renforcer la cohérence entre la politique nationale de protection sociale et l'initiative 3N. De même, la protection sociale est désormais une des composantes de la politique nationale de sécurité nutritionnelle, qui est une réforme mise en place également par l'initiative 3N. Donc, pour opérationnaliser ces orientations, en ce qui concerne la protection sociale, nous avons une administration des missions qui gère les questions de vulnérabilité chronique et conjoncturelle, qui s'appelle le dispositif national de prévention et gestion de crises alimentaires. Et ce dispositif, donc pour opérationnaliser ce dispositif, il a inclus désormais en son sein une cellule qu'on a appelée la cellule filets sociaux, qui est chargée de promouvoir et de coordonner les initiatives de transfert monétaire réguliers et qui sont prévisibles et pluriannuels, qui sont destinés aux ménages ruraux les plus pauvres. Parmi les expériences importantes de mise en œuvre des filets sociaux ces dernières années, nous avons des programmes de résilience qui ont été mis en œuvre par différents partenaires ici au Niger. Et ils allient le soutien direct en nature ou en espèces, donc finance en nature ou en espèces financières, aux ménages vulnérables, et également des interventions telles que le renforcement de l'accès aux services de nutrition, d'éducation, les aménagements communautaires qui restaurent les ressources naturelles et renforcent les bases productives ou encore le soutien aux chaînes de valeur. Ils accompagnent également les transferts monétaires pluriannuels aux ménages avec de la sensibilisation à la prévention de la malnutrition et des appuis aux actions productives et génératrices de revenus. Donc, ces actions intègrent également une composante réactive au choc. Des études récentes ont montré des résultats très intéressants en ce qui concerne ce type d'intervention sur la sécurité alimentaire des ménages et notamment leurs revenus également, ainsi que leur capacité à faire face au choc. Donc, ça renforce leur résilience, Ça renforce également la régénération des terres à travers les opérations de cash for work à grande échelle. L'initiative 3N est donc devenue un levier important d'accélération de la mise en œuvre des dispositifs de protection sociale à visée de sécurité alimentaire et nutritionnelle à travers les filets sociaux pluriannuels destinés aux ménages les plus pauvres, à travers des travaux à haute intensité de main-d'œuvre mobilisés chaque année en amont de la période de soudure, à travers la promotion de l'alimentation scolaire, à travers la disponibilité de services gratuits de prise en charge de la malnutrition aiguë, à travers la généralisation et la diffusion de bonnes pratiques familiales et de mesures de prévention de la malnutrition en accompagnement des actions d'assistance alimentaire et aussi à travers des réponses au choc lorsque ceci génère des pics d'insécurité alimentaire et nutritionnelle. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Your Excellency, for sharing these insights. I have a follow-up question for you. What are some of the evidence around the impact of the 3N initiative, in particular with regards to food security and nutrition?
Merci pour votre question. Alors, donc, l'initiative 3N, nous la mettons en œuvre depuis 2011, donc ça fait déjà 11 ans. Donc, nous avons fait le bilan de 10 ans de mise en œuvre et donc, après 10 ans de mise en œuvre de l'initiative, on peut citer un certain nombre de résultats tels que le doublement de superficie irriguée. Donc, je vous ai dit, dans le contexte de changement climatique, la première action d'adaptation, c'est le développement de l'irrigation de périmètres irrigués. Assurer que dans chaque village, quand les productions pluviales sont déficitaires, les communautés ont la possibilité des alternatives pour continuer de produire toute l'année. Donc, c'est le doublement. On a multiplié par 2 les surfaces irriguées. On a multiplié par 6 la production de cultures irriguées. Donc, en 10 ans, c'est un résultat extrêmement important. Et nous avons aussi restauré des centaines de milliers d'hectares de terres dégradées parce que les terres dégradées permettent, en les restaurant, on restaure le couvert végétal, mais surtout, on restaure des terres qui peuvent désormais produire des cultures alimentaires, mais aussi des cultures fourragères. Et nous avons accru de 86% le PIB du secteur rural et nous avons diminué de 10 points le taux de pauvreté rurale. Nous sommes passés en 2010-2011 de 56% de pauvreté rurale à 44% de pauvreté rurale. Donc ça, c'est un des résultats, c'est parmi les résultats importants de l'initiative 3N. Les activités du secteur agricole et de l'économie alimentaire sont également devenues une véritable perspective d'avenir pour les jeunes et les femmes qui sont de plus en plus investis dans ce domaine parce que simplement, ces catégories voient l'agriculture comme étant un business qui permet de gagner des revenus, qui permet d'avoir des ressources, qui permettent d'aller au-delà de la production alimentaire tout simplement. Mais c'est devenu un business, c'est vu comme ça. Ainsi donc, des milliers d'individus et de groupements sont appuyés chaque année à travers un mécanisme que nous avons mis en place dans le cadre de l'initiative 3N. Ces mécanismes sont mis à travers ce qu'on a appelé le Fonds d'investissement pour la sécurité alimentaire et nutritionnelle. Et ce fonds finance les projets des acteurs des chaînes de valeur, que ce soit dans l'amont de la production ou dans l'aval, notamment la transformation, la conservation des produits et la création de valeur ajoutée et des emplois à travers la transformation. Donc, sur certains plans, cependant, nous avons encore des résultats qui sont mitigés, notamment dans le domaine de la malnutrition, où nous avons encore des résultats assez peu satisfaisants et sur lesquels nous mettons un accent très fort dans le cadre du plan d'action actuel 2021-2025. Enfin, le secteur demeure également vulnérable aux effets du changement climatique, ce qui entraîne des aléas qui continuent d'affecter les systèmes productifs. À cela s'ajoutent les effets de l'insécurité liés au terrorisme sur nos frontières et qui fait des incursions dans nos territoires, à l'est du pays et également au sud-est du pays. Et donc, les efforts doivent encore être maintenus dans le cadre du plan d'action 2021-2025 et c'est ce que nous sommes en train de faire pour assurer que nous créons davantage de synergie entre les interventions à court, moyen et long terme dans une logique de nexus humanitaire, développement et paix. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Your Excellency, for sharing this success story out of Niger. Dr. Jimmy Adesini, you're now in the hot seat. In the interview that you were showcased yesterday, you mentioned that we need an expansive understanding of social protection to enhance food security and nutrition in Africa. Could you please elaborate more on what do you mean by expansive social protection, and what are some of the practical implications for policymaking? You have the floor.
No, thank you very much, Elizabeth. And thank you to all the panelists and all the participants. I think, you know, the idea of an expansive understanding of social protection comes from a much wider understanding of social protection as a component of social policy. And there are different instruments within social policy that perform the protection function, and that protects people against vulnerability, not only in response to external shock, but what one would call prophylactic social policy instruments. In other words, social policy instruments intended and designed to prevent people from falling into vulnerability. And an example of a broader understanding, you know, just to stay with that briefly, is that the tendency to generally emphasize transfers in cash, which is much of the discussions that we tend to hear, and different from what we heard from Excellency from Egypt and His Excellency from Niger, is that it does not pay attention to adequacy. You know, I mean, hardly do you hear a discussion around transfers in cash that deals with the question of adequacy. Secondly, they're vulnerable to high inflation environment. The purchasing power of the money gets easily depleted, and so on and so forth. And a key area, just as an example of a more expansive understanding of social policy, is agrarian support. You know, given the proportion of the population in Africa that lives in the rural area, given the extent to which over the last 30, 40 years, Africa has become largely food, you know, what they call import dependent, the whole idea of support for smallholder farmers in terms of knowledge, finance, seed, agricultural infrastructure, and so on and so forth, are particularly important. One, in ensuring food security, national, because the reason why the war in Ukraine is having so much deleterious impact on Africa is precisely because of, you know, the degree of import dependence, food import dependence, and so on and so forth. But we know that, you know, support for smallholder farmers that actually, you know, encourage productivity in farming households tend to ensure a smoothing, first of all, income for households, and a smoothing of consumption across the farming cycles, you know, and we know the extent to which poverty is cyclical around, you know, the farming season, and we need to support this with organization of national food strategic reserves, and so on and so forth. That's one aspect. The other aspect that we don't talk about, especially when we deal with this in terms of prophylactic, especially the implication for nutrition, has to do with education. I mean, when I went to, you know, primary school, you know, it doesn't matter whether you're the son of what do you call it, a gardener, or the son of a minister. You're in the same classroom. Today, we've had a highly stratified, a highly segmented educational system, and so on and so on. The investment in education, not just basic education, but up to higher education level, that is gender equitable, ensures we know that you know, more educated women with children that are with better nutritional status so on and so forth. In other words, along the lines that His Excellency from Niger, the Republic was talking on earlier on, to have a more expansive understanding of what we mean by protection, and focus on designing systems that are prophylactic, that seeks to prevent rather than respond to vulnerability. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adesina. I'm sure there's going to be so many questions coming from the audience, but for now, I want to thank you for your thought leadership. I would like to give the floor now to Mr. Joe Odiji. You are representing ITUC Africa, and we know that access to comprehensive social protection is very important for workers in Africa, right? Particularly those in informal and rural economy. What has been the experience of workers in advocating for the extension of social protection programs and schemes that respond in particular to food security and nutrition needs for these groups? You have the floor.
Thank you very much. And I want to appreciate the previous speakers. I think that they have equally spoken to some of the issues we will also want to prescribe as solutions. In other words, addressing factors that, triggers and exacerbate vulnerability rather than responding continuously to vulnerability as it were. But in terms of what we see on the ground, I will quickly make my presentation quickly in two rounds. The first is to say the categories of constituencies, communities, and workers we have targeted for this question are very critical. Informal economy worker and those in the rural areas. And what you find, I will go from Mr. Adesina's last point about school and feeding as a child. You find that what we have found on the ground in terms of the crisis is that the adequate nutritional support is pushing so many children into child labor and into bond labor. Bond labor in the sense that people then donate themselves in a way. I want to work in an agricultural plantation. I want to live in the farm, and so that I'll be able to have food and stuff to take care of myself and my family. The man comes to live in the farm, brings his or her family there. Man, the woman, they are there, and then the children also don't have access to education. Colleagues have talked about the crisis. You see from the war in Ukraine, how it is exacerbating inflation in terms of fuel and food crisis. That itself is an addition to what already exists on the continent, in the sense that insecurity has been foiling this situation on our continent, as it were. So the Ukraine situation is just exacerbating what still persists here. So rather than dealing with vulnerability issue per se, let's deal with factors that promote vulnerability. The insecurity situation on our continent is even making it difficult for people to farm. And so when it is possible to farm, how do you produce food? How do you address the nutrition crisis? So we also need to deal with insecurity situation on our continent, and it is fledgling and worrisome. Linked to that also is what we have found is our governments, quite a number of our governments are not opposed to social protection provisions, especially nutrition, food, and all of that component. When we adopted recommendation 202, social protection floors at the International Labour Organization conference processes, where over 98% of African government endorsed that recommendation. Until today, they still tell you, yeah, we believe in it. But when you ask them, why are you not implementing? Very simple answer they give you. The economy is stupid. And it is stupid because we don't have the finances, the monies to be able to deal with this. So what do we do as trade unions? We have been advocating strongly for how do we deal with illicit financial flows. We need monies to finance these things. And if monies are leaving our continent, between 60 and 80 billions, to use a very conservative figure of the African Union, we need to plug this. And you find a dilemma, a mismatch. During the COVID pandemic, for instance, why people were losing income, and for household, for workers, we must say this, 70% or thereabout of income are dedicated to food, to just food issues. And during COVID-19, even savings that were made were burnt off for just consumption. We're happy with what we saw in South Africa, the government using grants to try to show up household consumption. But of course, it didn't go around. Not a number of all our countries did this. But the crisis still is that under the pandemic, if I use the case of West Africa, the 3 richest men in West Africa grew their income to the tune of 17 billion or more than enough money to take care of our entire vaccination program on the continent as a health service issue. So the point for us is to be able to address this issue. We want to get first to these things that trigger them, and then secondly, addressing them together by using, plucking illicit financial flow, and then bringing about some kind of responsive taxation arrangement. Because what our figures tells us is that in Africa, if we have a good tax arrangement, I use West Africa again. Now, why I'm using West Africa is because ITUC Africa and Oxfam, under the COVID-19 period, focused on West Africa to say, what is COVID doing to people on the continent in terms of poverty? But let's use West Africa. And then how can we respond? Because what we are seeing is that governments are responding with austerity measures. This shouldn't be so. Rather, we want to see government respond with more sustainable approach. If you do a 1% tax, and the idea is to tax the rich, not the poor, a 1% tax of GDP for 5 years, or even 4 years, 2022 to 2026, we are able to generate $8.9 billion. And of course, these monies will take care of entire healthcare issues on the continent. And then if you create a durable job, including quality education provision, and if you create a good job that you can tax, then sufficiently you are able to finance social protection in a more sustainable way. And the last point I would say in terms of what we see is that with all this that we are clamoring, we are trying to address, salaries have not increased in recent time across. And when you talk about informal workers and the rural economy, largely those persons are not union-based. They are not unionized, largely. So these are the persons who need the benefits and the protection of a minimum wage. So if African countries can adopt minimum wage provisions, these persons who are outside the coverage of strong trade union voices for negotiation can be protected in terms of wages. And when they have protection of wages, like I said earlier, their wages go to consumption of food, then a better chance of that will come in, rather than the usual charity. The rural women, informal economy workers are not persons who believe in charity. They will want to see jobs, because job is at the heart of human dignity. Everybody will be able to fend for themselves. Thank you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Mr. Ojeshi. Thank you so much for being in the trenches on the front lines in advocacy. And I think you have certainly given our African governments and leaders some food for thought. I now want to turn to our next speaker, Mr. Douglas Opio. But before I do that, a reminder to our participants, we are about to enter into a very interactive portion of our agenda, the Q&A. So please start submitting your questions if you haven't done so already. Mr. Douglas Opio, the private sector has a significant role to play in Africa, both to ensure supply and availability of nutritious food, but we also know that they are there to finance social protection through their contribution to social security schemes. In your opinion, how can employers help strengthen the design and implementation of universal social protection that is responsive to food and nutrition themes in times of, in particular, crisis and beyond? You have the floor.
Thank you so much, moderator, and it was nice listening to your story. Thank you to the rest of the panelists and WFPA and ILO for having us. I think the panelists before me spoke quite nicely. I liked it from the trade union gentleman. That's the starting point. A decent job is by far the best form of social protection. So governments need to create an enabling environment for businesses to be able to create jobs. Now, turning on the point that you're asking me, the first is that well-established companies could use their systems to move businesses towards formalization. So companies, well-established companies, through their procurement processes, can create certain requirements that allow smaller ones to move into a formal setting. Because we are well aware that social protection is least in the informal sector. So by helping employers, helping the small and medium enterprises to formalize, they help to address the problem. Secondly, employers also can participate a lot more in generating evidence that is required for planning, especially through supporting administrative data that is built by the government. They can help the planning process. In addition, the logistical system across the country, colleagues on this panel also spoke about that. I think logistical efficiency can be improved, especially for moving food products. Employers are moving all sorts of consignments across the country. But if those consignments, the reverse element could be better organized so that food can be more effectively transported, I think we address the element of cost, we address also the element of it reaching the market faster. And closely linked to that, also the concept of big companies also acting as lead companies, essentially providing guarantees for smallholder farmers, helping them to sell their products at slightly more higher prices, helping them to get more high quality inputs. I think organizing the farmers and organizing other players on the lower end of the value chain could be extremely helpful. And I think it's a role that employers could play quite well. Finally, of course, the policy dialogue element. Employers can greatly contribute to the discussions that are linked to social protection. Because employers operate on the ground, they tend to know what works. And by participating in national dialogue around social protection, it's easier for us to support this process. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Actually, this is very inspiring. And I have a follow-up question for you. In your view, what are the main challenges to a healthier and more productive workforce in Africa? And is there anything that employers can do to support them overcome these challenges?
Thank you so much. The first is to drive the agenda around universal health coverage. We all know that access to food and food security is also closely linked with poverty. But we know one of the things that perpetually keep people in poverty is their health. When their health is not in the right state, then they risk actually losing their farmland, they risk losing their sources of livelihood, which actually make the conditions much worse. So employers can contribute towards this by fostering, supporting the processes of universal health coverage. Secondly, is the issue of skills. Skills by far is also a determinant of quality of livelihood. It's also a determinant of the quality of social protection that one might have, essentially a decent job. So employers can contribute towards the skilling agenda by opening their doors for apprentices to come and providing more opportunities for young people to get the required skills and grow through the system. Lastly is the question of awareness. We know the challenge is there. Awareness almost on every single issue is always raised. And companies can also contribute by raising a lot more awareness within the the communities that they operate. I've already spoken, for instance, just guaranteeing that smallholder farmers have access to quality products. That also guarantee they get the right yields. So basically, there are challenges, but I think there are challenges that employers can help to address. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Apio. And also thank you to our distinguished panel members for this very, very insightful conversation. Now I want to invite our audience to ask us questions. And I think I already have the first question. I know that we've spoken a lot earlier on about how social protection programs are critical to deliver and enhance food security and nutrition outcomes. Now let's turn that question around, right? And ask this question: how central is food security and nutrition for social protection success? Who wants to take that one? I'll repeat the question again.
Yeah.
How central is food security and nutrition for social protection success in enhancing human capital and broad social economic development?
Thank you. Maybe I'll try to answer it.
Thank you,
First,
Mr. Apio.
Thank you so much. I liked your story very much, sad, but also extremely informative. We see that even access to education can be constrained by access to food. That's why even for education, you have to provide school feeding. If it doesn't exist, then it's possible that children will never go through school. If they don't go through school, then the ability to have social protection or to contribute to formal social protection systems are compromised. So without food, you actually can't move anywhere. Secondly, for the working class, especially those on the lower end of the working class, food is a critical element because some of them are walking daily to work. Just imagine a situation where you're not able to go to work because you haven't had a meal. Also, we know that food has a direct link to the health situation of the worker, but also of the young one. So it's almost impossible to expect a high level of productivity when food security is not guaranteed as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Actually, Excellency Ali Bate, I have a question here for you, which also resonates personally, because the drought that I experienced at the age of 8 was because of the early impact of climate shocks. We just didn't have the fancy name climate change for it. And so the question is, how is the impact of seasonal shocks like droughts addressed as part of the 3N initiative? How is the impact of seasonal shocks like droughts addressed as part of your 3N initiative? Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. Donc, le Niger, je dois dire, est un pays qui a une très longue histoire avec les sécheresses et les crises alimentaires. Je l'ai vécu personnellement quand j'étais gamin en 1973, donc je sais ce que c'est. Et le Niger a appris de ça, on va dire. Et donc, le Niger a construit sa stratégie de l'initiative 3N en 2011 en considérant qu'il doit sortir de la vulnérabilité à l'insécurité alimentaire en réalisant des programmes structurants de développement agricole durable et de sécurité alimentaire et nutritionnelle dans ce contexte de changement climatique. Et donc, c'est pour ça que voilà, le Niger a construit cette stratégie. Et ainsi, donc, il a mis en place un dispositif national de prévention et gestion des crises qui fait aussi de l'alerte précoce et aujourd'hui qui, dans notre région Afrique de l'Ouest, fait référence. Donc, cette année encore, donc, du fait de cette crise, de ces chocs importants de crise alimentaire, donc l'État du Niger sera grand contributeur, le plus grand contributeur à la réponse à la soudure à travers des ventes de céréales à prix subventionnés, ainsi que de l'aliment pour le bétail aussi, parce que la crise s'est traduite aussi par un déficit de production fourragère de presque la moitié des besoins du bétail, des opérations de cash for work et aussi de food for work, et de distribution gratuite de céréales aux populations très vulnérables, des farines infantiles enrichies pour les familles très vulnérables qui ont besoin de ce soutien, ainsi que le renforcement des services nutritionnels ou encore l'extension des programmes de filets sociaux et des actions de filets sociaux qui sont réactifs au choc. L'enjeu donc pour l'initiative 3M, c'est désormais de mieux articuler les réponses d'urgence aux efforts structurants et notamment aux instruments de protection sociale. La stratégie du dispositif national de prévention et gestion des crises alimentaires, cette administration dont j'ai parlé, qui a été construite sur la base de nos expériences avec les sécheresses, vise à systématiser les mécanismes de filets sociaux afin de les rendre flexibles et extensibles pour une meilleure précocité et un meilleur coût-efficacité des réponses ponctuelles. Pour cela, certains chantiers sont prioritaires, notamment une meilleure coordination entre les différents organes en charge de la protection sociale et des réponses aux crises, l'opérationnalisation d'un registre social unifié qui permet la traçabilité des appuis et une extension rapide des filets sociaux de base lorsque cela s'avère nécessaire. Mais également la mise en place de fonds communs qui permettent d'une part de mettre à l'échelle effectivement les filets sociaux et d'autres instruments de protection sociale et d'autre part la mobilisation rapide des moyens de réponse aux divers chocs. Enfin, nous allons poursuivre et renforcer les efforts durables et structurants qui visent à réduire les vulnérabilités et améliorer la résilience en s'attaquant aux causes profondes de la faim et de la malnutrition. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. I have another question here. Maybe Mr. Joe Odigi, this one could be for you. There's a question regarding the sustainability of social protection, such as homegrown school feeding programs. And also, subsequently, how do we ensure that there's mutual accountability, since this actually requires different multi-sectoral partnerships to achieve this? Over to you, Joe, you have the floor.
Thank you. Well, I think partly what we need to do with this is they need to consciously include other non-state actors, social partners, framed very well in this way that we have had this discussion. For us, social dialogue has a big role to play in accountability, very big role to play in promoting accountability, as it were. And that means it means you have non-state actors that are able to help government in some way audit, the monitor and report and audit on the programs that have been rolled out, the social protection programs that have been rolled out. And then when you engage social dialogue in that sense, where non-state actors can contribute, you are able to harvest quite a number of ideas to the whole process in terms of how, what people really want. In other words, it should be needs driven, what kind of nutrition arrangement works for people, or what kind of social protection arrangement work for people, and which categories of persons should really be, would be interested to assess what is available. So in a sense, it's a way of improving participation in governance through respective voices from the social partners that are able to be involved. But on the issue of sustainability of food and as a program for social protection, I think somebody asked it, and I've seen it in the comment, and the school feeding arrangement. As trade unions, our workers, we subscribe to this, especially in the rural area. When you talk about children absenteeism and when they leave, I talked earlier about child labor. when the father, the mother, who are supposed to work to take care of the children, they don't earn enough to take care of their children, they withdraw their kids as additional hands on the farm, or for the woman who's a seamstress, as somebody who helped to sew at home. And then when they have 5 kids, for instance, you find a situation where, and maybe 2 of them are boys and 3 are girls. The girls are told to stay and help the mother, and the boys go to school. So it's more difficult for the girl child. What you need to do is, when you provide school feeding, you're able to keep them at school, and everybody, and the chances of them escaping generational poverty is high. But last, if you don't provide security for farmers, you can't attain food security. People need to farm in a safe and secure environment. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this input. Indeed, even at the World Food Program, we found that school feeding is such an incentive for girls to go to school. I do want to call upon Dr. Adesina, because there's so much conversation happening here. And you had also mentioned something about Mauritius, which could be a really good final contribution to our discussion today. And you spoke about how the country has taken good steps towards a universal social protection vision. Can you just share a little bit about that? I think we have 2 minutes for your concluding remarks. You are muted, Doctor.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you so much.
Well, Mauritius is a case that I'm surprised doesn't get mentioned enough. It demonstrates one dimension of this, which is that when we're talking about protecting people against vulnerability and in a prophylactic way, it is about additional commitment at the level of, it's not about inscribing it in law. It's about visionary agenda set. And it is not something you achieve when you become rich. When Mauritius started these things when its per capita income was $400. It's $9,500 now. And it includes, old age, pension, child support, and enhancing and ensuring what they call a home ownership, but universal publicly funded education all the way to university level, with free transport for learners to school. But it did that by also paying attention to its economy. I mean, otherwise, how do you grow an economy from $400 to $9,500? And I think it's in the way in which you strengthen these is also the way in which you strengthen social cohesion in society, and it speaks to something that Mr. Didier mentioned earlier on. And I will hazard, make this project that the reason why we've ended up with high level of insecurity, Nigeria, my home country, is an example, is precisely the collapse of relationship between state and citizen. When it got to a point where states didn't think it was its responsibility to take care of its citizens and so on and so forth. And then the hostility that begins. If you look at Mauritius generally, it's an area that we need to learn a lot from, not because it's a perfect example, but because it sets the agenda and the idea of social consensus around, additional commitment to these issues.
Well, thank you so much, Doctor, for these insights, and what an inspiring conversation. What a perfect way to bring our session to a close as well. A few thank yous are in order. First, thank to you, each and every one of our participants, for sharing your perspectives, your insights, and your expertise. Thank you also to the organizers for creating this space for dialogue and action. And finally, a big thank you to our participants for your presence, your attention, and your participation. This meeting is ending, but the Africa Dialogue series continues. The next coming years are a critical time to advance food security and stronger social protection systems in Africa. The choices we make in the months and years ahead will set the course for the decades to come. We cannot allow the pandemic to undo the immense progress we've made and threaten the delicate and complex nutritional systems that support healthy people, cultures, and societies. It's been an absolute pleasure to host this event in the company of such honorable guests, and I look forward to hearing the key messages shared today echoed beyond the conclusion of this edition of the Africa Dialogue series. To close this event, it is my honor to give the floor to Mr. Musa Omaru, Deputy Director General, Field Operations and Partnerships at ILO, for a final call to action. You have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Madame, de me donner la parole, mais merci aussi pour le travail de modération que vous avez accompli avec brio pour cette session-là. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, je voudrais simplement dire qu'il a été très réconfortant, voire stimulant, d'entendre les bonnes pratiques et les enseignements qu'on peut tirer de la part de nos illustres panélistes qui viennent des États membres, des agences des Nations Unies, les experts universitaires et les partenaires sociaux. Cela montre les efforts significatifs déployés pour mettre à profit le pouvoir, j'allais dire les vertus de la protection sociale, dans la promotion de la sécurité alimentaire et de la nutrition pour une plus grande résilience et la prospérité en Afrique. Je voudrais, en concluant cette session, mettre en lumière le besoin urgent de renforcer et d'étendre la protection sociale en Afrique, notamment en plaçant la sécurité alimentaire et la nutrition au cœur des mécanismes de protection sociale adaptés au choc de manière équitable et durable. Je vous rappelle, l'objectif continental d'étendre la couverture en protection sociale à au moins 40% de la population africaine d'ici 2025. Ce rappel est important. Et vous me direz que c'est un objectif ambitieux, oui, il l'est certes, mais très nécessaire car les Africains ne peuvent plus attendre. Si nous voulons réaliser les aspirations fixées par les ODD et l'agenda 2063 de l'Union africaine, nous devons faire plus, nous devons agir maintenant, nous devons faire les choses différemment pour accélérer les progrès dans la promotion de la justice sociale. Permettez-moi donc de formuler quelques messages et leur implication pour les décideurs politiques et les autres acteurs. 1. Il s'agit de garantir une protection sociale universelle, complète et adéquate tout au long du cycle de vie. Cela devrait favoriser l'inclusion des personnes en situation de vulnérabilité et d'inégalités diverses. Et vous savez que ces inégalités sont diverses parce qu'elles sont souvent croisées par leur aspect économique, social et démographique. Et tout ceci afin d'atteindre les personnes les plus en marge. 2. Cette démarche exige d'intégrer formellement et clairement les objectifs de sécurité alimentaire et de nutrition dans les stratégies, politiques et programmes de protection sociale afin de répondre aux besoins des personnes et de promouvoir leur bien-être d'aujourd'hui et de demain. 3. Il s'agit également d'adopter des approches résilientes et adaptées au choc afin de mieux équiper les populations à gérer les risques lors des situations d'urgence soudaine ou de stress saisonnier, tout en favorisant la coordination entre les acteurs sur le terrain notamment à travers le nexus humanitaire développement-paix. 4. La nécessité de renforcer la gouvernance des systèmes de protection sociale par le biais d'un leadership institutionnel, d'une coordination multisectorielle et multipartite, du dialogue social, ainsi que des solutions innovantes telles que les technologies numériques. Ce n'est qu'en adoptant une approche intégrée qui crée des synergies entre les secteurs comme l'agriculture, la santé et l'éducation que nous pourrons améliorer la couverture, l'adéquation, l'exhaustivité, la qualité et la réactivité des systèmes de protection sociale. 5. Enfin, il est crucial d'assurer la pérennité de la protection sociale en privilégiant des formes de financement à long terme fiables et équitables, en se concentrant sur l'augmentation des allocations des ressources nationales, complétée éventuellement par la coopération internationale. En gardant ces considérations à l'esprit, nous pouvons mettre la protection sociale au service de la prospérité et de la dignité des Africains. La protection sociale n'est pas seulement une partie importante de la solution pour atteindre les objectifs de développement humain. Elle est une condition de justice sociale et, en tant que telle, un droit de l'homme. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, mon point final est de vous assurer du soutien du système des Nations Unies pour vous fournir les appuis nécessaires pour l'élaboration et la mise en œuvre des politiques et des systèmes de protection sociale susceptibles de renforcer la sécurité alimentaire et la nutrition pour une plus grande résilience en Afrique. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. I think we have reached the end of our event, and thank you for everyone's participation, and looking forward to continued conversation. I will hand it over as opposed to USG Duarte.
Unfortunately, the USG had to leave the meeting.
Okay, so allow me to mark this event as concluded. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and bye.
Okay. Bye.